Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello there.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We're coming to you live from on the road this morning. So if our recording sounds a little bit different, please forgive us for using our mobile rig.
We're sitting in a motel room
We are,
that's situated behind the business that runs it,
which is
a hardware store.
the Combination Motel Hardware Store.
Mm-hmm. It's a great little place. We love it here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to sound like we're in a motel room.
So you're on the far side of your museum fellowship. Do you want to give a little update on how that went?
Oh, so wonderful. I just spent 4 nights in D.C. I'm getting to study at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and working with some of the most incredible educators and historians and curators and just all of these experts. And I just feel very lucky and fortunate to have been in that room and to have access to those brains and materials and all kinds of things. So probably one of the best things I've ever done, not only for myself personally, but also like as a teacher. I left there telling my coworkers, like, you've got to get into this and do it. Very rewarding work and just very excited.
Cool. I'm glad you had a good time. You seem very energized about it.
Yeah, and I met some really wonderful people in that really, I think that's what teaching is about. And so
Absolutely.
I feel very fortunate to have, like I said, been in that room and had access to those people. I'll have more information as I continue through my fellowship year, and I'll go back next summer.
Yeah.
And finish it.
The journey continues.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
That was just the first step.
All right. We would like to start with our education news headline roundup. This is where we compile and analyze the most compelling stories and research from around the world about everything having to do with learning and teaching and leading in schools and other educational organizations. Just so you know, we stick all of our sources for these headlines in the show notes for each episode. You can find those on our website at 16to1.com/archives. Would you like to take our first headline?
Here we go.
What are we talking about this week?
This is from Bloomberg Philanthropies. So that's the charitable organization founded by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. They recently announced that it's making a $1 billion donation to Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. It's a gift that will cover tuition for a majority of students at the medical school. Their aim is to reverse the trend in the declining life expectancy for U.S. citizens, especially post-COVID-19. So this quote from their press release states, "This new gift ensures the most talented, aspiring doctors representing the broadest range of socioeconomic backgrounds will have the opportunity to graduate debt-free from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine."
Yeah. I always think the way that we talk about these kinds of philanthropic gifts is interesting because I want to say that Johns Hopkins is still a pretty highly selective private university. I think I looked it up and it said a little more than 7% of applicants that apply are admitted. And the student body is composed of learners with pretty high marks. So like 99% of students at Johns Hopkins were in the top 10% of their high school graduating classes. And their ACT middle 50th percentile was like 34, 35.
Oh my gosh.
So
The middle score is a 34?
yeah. So it's great to me that a majority of students are now going to be able to attend tuition free. I think there's still a pipeline problem to solve here. I just thought the language was interesting. They're like, students from all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. It's like, well, those students don't necessarily have the tools that they need to get into those highly competitive university programs. We just know that there are certain advantages that come with, a higher socioeconomic bracket. Yeah. So I would love to see Bloomberg also direct some of this giving to a little bit earlier in the pipeline so that incoming students have a better chance across the board. But this is an interesting gift. We have a lot of friends in the Baltimore area, and they were all talking about this because this is a pretty big deal.
I think it is a big deal, and I do understand what you're saying. I think it is nice to give these funds to people who maybe dreamed of medical school and maybe didn't see that through because of the exorbitant cost. Even if they were some of these, more privileged, whatever. We need good doctors and nurses, and we need
I was
capable people.
So. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking at the statistics, and it was saying something like tuition would be free for, I think, 95% of American families. Wow. So everybody, it was like, I can't remember. It was either 300,000 or 350,000 annual family income, I think. So anyone under that would get tuition free.
Okay.
So,
that's
anyway,
pretty. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big chunk.
It is a big chunk, and at least they're putting that money into something that could help. It's hard to say how many thousands and millions of people.
Yeah. Okay. So then next we have a science of reading update. Oh, you're laughing.
Oops.
Do you have any more comments on the mandated PD, the professional development that you're doing?
My update is that it's a top priority when I get home from vacation. Because I haven't done it yet.
So you still just have done the first section.
Yep.
Okay.
Do as I say, not as I do. Students do as I say, not as I do.
I am very curious to see how the rest of that goes because I've been hearing some
Me too.
interesting.
Me too.
I've been hearing some interesting stories. Okay.
I promise by the next recording I'll have an actual something to say.
Okay. More substance and thoughts next time. All right. I wanted to update on this because I was randomly scrolling through Mastodon because I don't do Twitter anymore. But I follow Alfie Kohn on Mastodon. He is the writer of Punished by Rewards, which is that book that I talk about a whole lot because I read it and I really liked it. He shared a link to an article and a video talk that was basically the same content as the article. And the article was called What You See Is Not What You Get, Science of Reading Reform as a Guise for Standardization, Centralization, and Privatization. This is by Dr. Elena Aydarova, assistant professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We've talked a lot about the academic approach to the science of reading on this podcast. We did a whole episode on it, but Dr. Aydarova in this talk and paper deals heavily with the policy approach. And she argues that while science of reading policy reforms claim to be grounded in scientific research, they can tend to mask underlying motives. And she tends to think that those motives are standardization, centralization, and privatization in education. And she makes this case. She analyzes advocacy efforts and legislative deliberations in Tennessee, which is, as we've talked about before, the Midwest's favorite proving grounds for education reform for some reason. And
some reason.
Yeah. She depicts this kind of tangled web of private interests and conservative think tanks that are motivating much of the science of reading policy discourse that is happening right now. And this is somehow a little bit surprising just because science of reading is so new and I hadn't really heard this angle yet, but also not really surprising because this just happens in educational policy. So anyway, it's a super interesting article.
Someone's always scratching somebody else's back.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting article and I think worth a read. We'll share that in the show notes. Please go read the paper. But after I read that, I got into this little back and forth with Alfie Kohn. I kind of was picking on him a little bit because he, in his original post where he shared this thing, he wondered whether the science of reading policy should be called something like Education's Project 2025. And I was like, whoa. That's, given the extremist nature of that particular policy platform, I was like, yikes, maybe I should pay more attention to what is going on here, given the conversation around science of reading. So kind of reacted to this. I was like, I don't know where this is coming from. I mean, I read the article and then it made more sense, but I was like, I've been talking to the teachers in my life and they've said that ever since Emily Hanford's original reporting with APM on this came out, that Sold a Story podcast that we talked about and a couple of other pieces related to that, they've become increasingly aware of the conversation around balanced literacy versus science of reading. And I was kind of generalizing on behalf of you and all teachers in my life, but I was like, they kind of feel like the rug has been pulled out from underneath them and they don't always know who to trust because they thought that their teacher education programs were equipping them with evidence-based
the proper
approaches to teaching literacy. And I was like, I'm not a huge fan of what some of the balanced literacy people continue to do in the aftermath of new science that is showing that maybe this is not the best approach. And he responded and said, okay, some commercial approaches are not good, but the whole language approach broadly and a context-rich focus on what he said are real books, whatever that meant to him, works. And I was like, okay. And he's like, he said that science of reading at the policy level, it has a focus on what he called decontextualized skills and testing, which allows it to lean into some of these more commercial interests and authoritarian models of learning. And he also suggested that using current test scores to lend validity to the idea of a literacy crisis ends up in this kind of overblown sense of crisis.
Sure.
And I was like, we were going back and forth for a bit on whether or not crisis language was appropriate. Because I was like, I don't know, man. It kind of feels like crisis is appropriate for your relationship with your students' literacy. I don't know, your students and their relationship with literacy, I guess I should say. Do you think that's...
Yeah, they can't read. That feels like a crisis. Okay. Americans can't read.
I was like, look, I said, okay, teachers feel this way about everything now, though, that's happening in educational policy. They feel left out of the conversation and that policy is driving student disengagement. And I said, anecdotally, you all teachers don't seem to be talking about test scores for the most part when you're talking about a literacy crisis. Right. It sounds like you're talking about kind of a broader lack of engagement and curiosity and critical thinking and interest in learning in the first place, probably because of standardized and centralized and privatized approaches.
Yeah.
And this whole back and forth ended with him giving me a kind of ominous warning about how other people aren't meaning that necessarily when they're talking about the literacy crisis, and that we should be kind of careful when we use these words since they can be weaponized to support certain interests that aren't looking out for what is best for students. And I do agree with that. And then he was like, hey, by the way, I wrote a book about this. Maybe you should read it. And that was like his way of very politely being like...
With you. He ended that conversation. He said,
No, he was very polite about it, but he was like, I think you should read this. And then he linked me to one of his other books. And I was
He gave you homework?
Okay, I'll read it. So I'm going to read it and get back to him.
Wow, he gave you homework. That's tough.
It was a very interesting conversation, though, because I feel like he was trying to say, hey, we should be careful about saying this is a literacy crisis because we're overblowing the status of this a little bit in order to essentially drive people to buy certain curriculum materials.
Yeah.
Which is how teachers feel about, like I said, that's how teachers feel about everything that they're being told.
I agree.
From top down.
Yeah. When I was jokingly like, this is a crisis, it's because like my kids don't have great comprehension skills and they don't enjoy reading. And so these are all the things that make it hard to teach English, right?
Yeah.
And not that every one of my learners should be someone who reads for fun, but it's a hell of a lot easier if they do. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of what they've grown up with and how they've been taught reading has made them hesitant and has turned them off. And I think that's part of this crisis, is that we're not building good reading skills in them to make them want to read, to make them want to find books that reach them.
Absolutely.
So what are we really getting into today?
Our main topic for this episode is textbooks. I'm going to try not to make that as boring as it sounds, but we're going to talk about how they're written, published, and adopted. Yeah. And it's actually a little bit related to this conversation I had with Alfie Kohn.
It is. It is.
So just about how things get standardized and smooshed down into easily digestible chunks for the purpose of curriculum. Okay, so...
Okay.
Yeah, what are textbooks? I mean, they're kind of a strange curricular artifact.
Sure.
I think.
So they are educational resources that provide structured and comprehensive information on specific subjects. They're used in schools to align with educational standards and curricula to prioritize consistency and learning objectives. Mm-hmm. They offer a coherent and sequenced presentation of material. Coherent is a bit of a strong word, but we'll go with it. They serve as a guide for lesson planning and instruction. They provide a presumably reliable source of information for students to review, study, and complete assignments. And they help students prepare for standardized tests and exams through practice exercises and review sections.
Yeah.
Presumably reliable and coherent are some big phrases for these things, but we'll go on.
I was trying to be generous
Yes, you
with
were.
what they aim to do.
Yes, that's true. They do.
Yeah.
They do aim for those things.
These are the goals.
So how does it work?
Well,
How do you make a textbook?
how do you make a textbook? I actually went and looked at the Oxford University Press has this cute little infographic.
They did. It's like 25 steps.
It's so many steps. It's a
I
lot
read
of
that.
steps.
It was a cute infographic, though.
They were just like, how is a textbook made? And their very first thing was like, number 1, identify a market need.
Yeah. Okay. Oxford.
Which is like, okay, I get it. That's a consumeristic way of saying certain students need to have certain information. So I just want to say a little bit about the textbook market, because this feeds into more centralization issues. And that's that in the US market, there are really only a couple of publishers with big chunks of market share. And then I'm sure there are tons of tiny little independent publishers, but they're just all scrapping, and these giant behemoth mega monopoly merged publishers control a huge majority of the market share. So the biggest publishers by market share in the US are Pearson, which is actually headquartered in the UK, Cengage, McGraw-Hill, and Wiley. There might be a few others in there, but those are...
Yeah, there's that Houghton.
Houghton Mifflin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I'll have a note about that. But there are some other big ones, but these tend to be the largest, and they kind of, share back and forth about who's on top. But I did want to note, Cengage and McGraw-Hill tried to merge back in 2019. They called off the merger after the DOJ was like, not sure about this, y'all. And then Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, the one you were just mentioning, is another big player. They were acquired by Veritas Capital, and they were delisted from NASDAQ a couple years ago. The industry trends, regardless, deeper and deeper toward mergers and consolidations. This is happening with publishing more broadly. This is not just in academic publishing, but so anyway, everything is just consolidating. There are fewer and fewer companies that are actually responsible for getting the majority of textbooks out to students in the real world. So I just had a really interesting side note here. Did you know that Pearson once had aviation fuel and energy divisions, and they were acquired and nationalized by the British government in the 40s?
No.
I didn't know that either.
What?
I was like, okay, so the people that I think of as being synonymous with education content had an aviation division. So.
Why not?
Okay.
Oh, right in time for the war.
Yes.
Good for them. Way to go, Pearson.
I don't know that they had a choice.
Oh.
I don't know that it was like that. Bam.
Oh.
I think
this is one of those.
This is ours now.
Acquired.
Acquired.
That's a big word.
It's acquired as in like eminent domain.
You're ours.
Acquired.
This is a war effort.
Yeah. Okay.
Winston Churchill said, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Yoink.
Yeah, I didn't look into the super specifics of that acquisition, but I'm not sure that it was voluntary or optional.
Oh, what a good British thing to do during a wartime. Just keep calm and carry on, and then no.
I might be speaking out of turn. Maybe they were like,
also,
here you
I'm
go.
mixing my wars with those phrases.
Well,
keep
yes.
calm and carry on as World War I, but still very British of them. Still
same vibe.
I'm sure that Pearson did not have the choice in the acquisition.
Maybe they did. I didn't look deep into it, but
sure.
I'm gonna guess it was maybe less than. They were less than excited about it. Perhaps.
Acquired and nationalized is kind of the key phrase there.
Yes.
Nationalized doing a lot of work in that sentence.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, back to textbooks. I was kind of trying to figure out about how long it takes to write a typical first edition, and the estimates I was seeing were 1 to 3 years or 2 to 4 years. Maybe it's on the order of years regardless. And textbooks often involve multiple authors or contributors, which can mean it takes even longer.
Yeah.
Obviously, all the back and forth. I think the process is pretty straightforward, if a bit lengthy, because of all of the independent consulting and confirmation and review that happens. But basically, an author gets together with a publisher. So that's one of those those big names that we just mentioned. The publisher will shop around a proposal to different academics and consulting committees. There are lots of checks and balances and sign-offs along the way in this process. But so the author will start work. They'll submit drafts to all of these different review committees. They'll keep drafting, keep reviewing, blah, blah, blah. That process goes on for quite a while. And then design and layout start to happen. The editing process, wiring permissions for licensed content, proofreading, creating digital editions, and then finally printing and distribution. And voila.
A textbook.
Yeah, so that's not too complicated. What about the marketing? How do textbooks get sold?
Door-to-door salesman.
Door-to-door.
That's what it feels like when you go to a national conference.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so in a lot of ways, it's just like what you'd expect, right? Social media promotions, email. I think my school must give my email to anyone who wants it. Trade shows, like I said, websites, advanced review copies. We get tons of advanced review copies. Like, we will just get pounds and pounds of books, and they just get thrown at us. And they're like, here, these just showed up. And I'm like,
that's really interesting. I worked at an education nonprofit for a little while that produced educational materials, and we were in a constant battle about review copies because these huge publishers can afford to just plaster their review copies everywhere, and for us that's like a significant chunk of our business to be able to provide review copies to people over and over again. And then the other thing is people tend to make copies of review copies
and never buy the actual thing.
So they'll just like pass out watermarked copies of things to their students, like, here you go. And it's really hard if you're an independent publisher in this space, especially a nonprofit independent publisher. Anyway, yes, review copies, very important.
So yeah, that's how I mostly have seen these things. I've been through a couple of rounds of textbook adoption in my classroom, but that's how they hit you. That's how they find you. So they have to form customer connections with schools, libraries, research institutions. And like I said, they show up at all the academic conferences. They even now show up on college campuses and market especially their digital textbooks directly to students. And that's something I've seen more and more happen in our high school as well.
Yeah. Really? They'll come to high schools?
The publishers?
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll send people to high schools.
To talk to students directly.
They usually will do it as like we're here to talk to teachers, but also we want to talk to the students and get them excited about this thing. And they think that will like make it work.
Yeah. I was seeing this particularly with relation to like I said, the digital textbooks. They seem to be very much like trying to skip over the admins entirely and just go directly to the students about the digital adoption. Super interesting.
Well, it's not going to work. So
I know that. I mean, it's a hard sell. They're often very expensive, and so Anyway,
so for the adoption of a textbook, schools and districts evaluate textbooks for alignment with their curriculum and their standards. This process might involve review committees, pilot testing, and feedback from teachers and students, and then once approved, the textbooks are officially adopted and purchased for use in classrooms. Yeah. In my high school, we have a fund that comes up every 7 years for a department.
Every 7 years?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Just think of how much the world can change in 7 years. I would just like to throw that out there. Like you're maybe only getting new ones of these, maybe every 7 years, but probably
textbooks.
Yes, but probably less often than that because it's not the case that you're going to get a new one every time this comes up, right?
I mean, the textbooks that I have in my classroom are, I think, copyright 1999.
I was going to say, I think you have textbooks in there that
I do.
I used in high school.
Yes.
Okay.
I found your name in them. Okay, so here's one thing I do want to say about English specifically. Yeah. I open the textbook. It has Julius Caesar. Shakespeare hasn't done any recent edits.
That's true.
So that copy of Julius Caesar holds, right?
True.
So in the world of an English classroom, I will say mileage may vary.
Yes.
For a textbook.
I bet this is true with different subjects as well.
Although, I don't think I would say history should go this long.
Yeah, I was just about to say, can you imagine our attitudes of history not having been revised in like 7 or 14 or 20 years?
Even when they're revised, they're not accurate, so it doesn't matter. Sure. Anyways, I will say that as an English teacher, this is a little bit different because, like I said, Shakespeare's no longer doing edits. Caesar's kind of where it's at, Caesar's not going to change.
I hear you, but at the same time, do you think that the selections that are in the book, for example, should be updated maybe more often than that?
Yeah, they definitely could be.
Right. So it's not as if Shakespeare is changing, but maybe our attitudes or our needs as a society have changed, and now we maybe need to draw a little more attention to other kinds of texts or whatever it may be.
And so the thing that we get to do with our money is 2 school years ago was our committee year for textbooks. We didn't want a textbook. One, we couldn't agree in our department on which textbook we should get.
Interesting.
We shopped a few, and we all like different things. And the school will not do that, obviously, because you get the bundle and whatever.
Do you get like a bulk discount or something?
Yeah, and then, the thought is like, these publishers build these things so that you get the 9th through 12th, and by the end of it, you'll have this cohesive whatever. But a couple of us liked one and a couple of us liked another, and so we ended up not choosing one. And I think the school probably wanted us to pick one, but we didn't. So we ended up picking class text. So we got to pick books to buy class sets for.
So you're still buying curricular materials, but just not textbooks.
So in this case, I bought 7 new classroom sets of books.
Gotcha.
Now, I will say I did buy a replacement of Caesar so I could phase out my textbook.
Okay.
And I bought a replacement of Antigone so I could phase out the textbook.
Okay.
So I did buy the Shakespeare pieces, but what I was able to do was buy class sets to actually start phasing out my textbooks.
Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about why you might be phasing out your textbook in a second. But just before we get there, how do these publishers keep up with trends? Like, how do they stay, how do they, I guess the market is getting like more and more,
the most popular people on earth. Yeah. They have like digital versions. They want additional resources like audio and video and slideshows and workbooks and worksheets and study guides and X amount of uses for the online textbook. And if you're a science teacher, you can do your labs online and all this kind of stuff. So they really, these publishers have some big money because the stuff that they can pull out is kind of impressive, honestly. I'm not going to lie.
You like some of the supplemental materials?
Some of the stuff that they do is really good.
Interesting.
Some.
Okay. Some.
Please hear my some.
Okay.
Here's the thing. I get hesitant for anyone to follow a textbook from cover to cover.
Yeah. I'm sure there are people who teach the textbook cover to cover, but I never happen to have one, I don't think. I think most times when textbooks were used in my classrooms, it was like, we're going to read some excerpts because they were, like you said, like, oh, Caesar's in this textbook. Yeah. And so we're reading from the textbook today. But
not that there can't be great units or something like that. But I generally would not be supportive of a cover-to-cover event.
Yeah.
In any classroom.
Right.
Because I think you have to, as a teacher, build and mold and evolve. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of active things that have to happen with it. Not that you can't cover an entire textbook in a classroom, in a class year, but that you have to do a lot to make it work.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
I understand. Yeah. And let's get into it. Let's talk about some of the critiques of textbooks as curricular aids. We're already talking about how they tend to, especially with these adoption cycles that you're talking about in like public schools, maybe not as big of a problem in universities, but still limited budgets there and limited numbers of purchases going on. But anyway, they tend to lag behind current events, latest research, so they can become obsolete. And even in the sense of what I was saying with like, hey, maybe we have particular problems going on in the world right now that demand particular solutions or approaches or whatever it may be. Like maybe we should be having different conversations just because of what is happening in the world right now. Now, like you were saying, that can be more or less true depending on the subject. But the whole point of textbooks is to kind of like solidify something that's supposed to last for quite a while.
For sure.
I will say that's another way that publishers will try to kind of squeeze out some more sales is to offer updated editions of textbooks. That's another, a revision to a textbook edition.
Or an updated workbook or an updated online package or whatever. Yeah.
Right. So I guess why else, you're talking about some of these other reasons why you might not maybe be a little more hesitant to use textbooks. maybe you're phasing them out, maybe you don't use them cover to cover. What are some of these other issues that you've encountered that might keep you hesitant about them?
I mean, other than them just like lagging behind current events, like we already kind of mentioned, research changes so frequently that I already know about the way that these questions work in my, how old is that book? 25 years old classroom book now. It's a little dated. Some of the connections they make are a little lost on my students.
Yeah.
And so
I've heard people, just real quick, argue for like a timelessness of certain things, knowledge, whatever it may be. And I'm like, no. Certain knowledge is timeless. I get it. But also, I get a little concerned when we treat knowledge, even of things that we're pretty sure aren't going to change, as like 100% certain, unchanging. I don't know. I treat a lot of my learning, the things the information I acquire, I treat a lot of it as provisional.
For sure.
Just because it's a way to sort of be humble in the face of new things that could come down the line. Like, we don't want to be so certain in our beliefs that we never revisit old things that we thought we think we know. And textbooks, I think, kind of unfortunately play into that trend of calcification of knowledge.
Well, and like, they can reflect a bias, right? They can lag perspectives. These are all portions of what you're talking about. I have seen textbooks that the section about the Holocaust is about 3 pages.
Yeah.
That's lacking. Okay. So other things.
Well, let me just tack onto that for a second. The biases and lack of diverse perspectives can absolutely come into play if you're trusting one person's. I mean, well, not one person, because we've gone through how these textbooks are composed by a committee, kind of, but like they do have an author or a couple authors. But regardless, you're reflecting the academic views, the whatever literary views of a very limited number of people. That reflects a certain approach, lifestyle, whatever it may be. You're just limiting the scope. You're shrinking the world down to this tiny little window on it, and that's what you're looking through when you read a textbook. Yeah. So just even the act of putting a textbook together itself, you will include bias whether or not you want to, or whether or not you think you are. So anyway, okay, go ahead.
So a few other things. The high prices, right, can be really difficult for students in schools. Students might not be able to afford the additional things like a book, a workbook or something, if that's something that
or a digital version.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This was when I was in grad school, this was a big deal because classes were requiring the paper copies, but students wanted the digital copies. So if they wanted like a searchable version, a digital copy, they had to buy it twice, which means huge big bucks spending on behalf of the students, like hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, when I was in my undergrad, they didn't let us have any of the digital textbooks, but people definitely wanted them. These books can contain errors or poorly explained concepts, like we mentioned. They may promote standardization and a one-size-fits-all approach. They might focus on test prep rather than deepening and understanding and critical thinking.
Yeah.
They probably just include lists of facts rather than any kind of deeper engagement with a difficult concept or having conversations around these, intense things. And it's hard to replace them. It takes hours and hours of work to completely redo your learning around.
You mean from a teacher's perspective?
Yeah, like,
got you.
It's really hard to replace a textbook that you've been using for a long time, and it's just the goofy stuff, like what page is this on, or they might use a different translation of a text we've been using, and so the phrases aren't. You know what I mean? It's just like there's a lot of work that teachers do to make a textbook work for them. And even getting the newer version of it is a lot of work, which keeps teachers attached to 25-year-old textbooks. Right. I mean, I know that Shakespeare's Julius Caesar text, I can see those pages. I can tell you what page it's on. Like, I am so deeply, attached to that. Not to that textbook, but the way that it's presented in that book.
Right.
And that's what all my worksheets go with, right?
Yep.
So even if I got a new textbook, I have to change all the page numbers. I'd have to make sure it's the exact same translation, because there are different versions of Caesar, right? Depending on their friendliness for a high school level. So it's a lot of work to ask teachers to do this frequently.
When I was researching about the process of how this is made, I ran across, it was kind of like a blog piece by an academic who had created textbooks. I was basically like trying to make the case for why you would want to use a textbook as opposed to a collection of original sources? And I'm going to ask you that question in a second, so hold on to it. But he was basically like, yeah, I recommend using textbooks, and I recommend that you write your own. I was like, wait. And he's like, oh, and by the way, here's mine that I wrote. And I was like, okay, so you're actually not suggesting that we use textbooks. You're suggesting that teachers create lesson plans and use them and publish them, which I guess technically is a textbook at the end of the day if it gets published, but you're suggesting that you do your own work to create your curriculum, which is to me kind of opposed to the project of a textbook, which standardizes an approach to a class.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I thought that was a pretty weird one. But anyway, okay, well, let's get into it. Let's discuss it. Advantages, disadvantages of using textbooks as opposed to collections of original sources or, your own lesson plans or whatever it is that you're finding, piecemeal, basically a course together instead of using a textbook.
Great question. Advantages. It's something that is provided to every student. They're all working off the same thing. That's nice.
Wait, why is the uniformity nice, though? Because
your socioeconomic status has nothing to do with receiving that book because the school has provided it to you.
Okay. That's, you're talking about in public school context specifically. So
yes.
Once you get to college, though, what you just said is no longer the case.
That's true.
Okay.
I teach high school. I'm talking about high school.
Yeah.
That's nice because everybody has the same thing.
Okay.
Disadvantages. That's the only advantage I can really think of.
Okay. Is that it levels the playing field for text availability.
Yeah. The other thing is that I do think that there's an advantage for young teachers to have access to a textbook that can kind of help mold their curriculum and maybe help them establish themes or ideas or whatever. I think that can be a really strong guiding force for an early teacher.
Teachers who are new to the profession.
Or even to a teacher who's teaching a new class. I think that could be very useful. So I do think that they help us establish some time frames or periods or themes or whatever. I think that's good.
I do think that they can help with structure and scaffolding. Here's an approach to thinking about this very complicated topic in a sort of systematic way. The issue there is that it's kind of like pre-digesting your thoughts. It's I've already done the work of thinking through how these things are in conversation with one another. Here you go.
But for a young teacher, that type of foundation can be really nice. Because I know when we hired our most recent 2 new English teachers, they were both like, so you don't use a textbook, so you just kind of go with, and so not that they weren't completely capable, but I do think that a little bit of guidance of a textbook might have helped them establish some more set, and then to build from that. So.
I personally want to see that kind of guidance come from peer educators rather than from a textbook. That's my bias.
And not that it can't, but okay, so for example, my one Allison, my one coworker, right, she took over the American Lit class. The teacher who taught it before her, I knew some of what he taught. I couldn't have told you exactly what year he started or what themes he covered or something like that. So as much as I can have an opinion on where I think American literature should be taught or what kind of it should be taught, I still don't have that, and that would be as a more senior member of the department. I didn't, So I think in a case like that, she was able to talk to him, which helped her kind of guide where she wanted to start with American literature and things like that, which is great. But
so it can be kind of one way to access a sort of institutional knowledge of best practices in a subject. So. Yeah, I get that.
I don't pretend to know everything that all my coworkers teach either. We have a huge spreadsheet that has everything we all teach, but I don't, that's not my lane. I stay in my lane. So
yeah,
not that it's a bad thing to know or to not know, but I just.
Okay, well,
those are some of my thoughts.
Let me follow on that question with a somewhat related one, and this is kind of getting back to the Alfie Kohn conversation. What does it mean to see a textbook as an authoritative source of information?
For students, it's a very weird thing to read something in a textbook and then be told yes but. And so or
yes and or
sure.
Yeah.
it's very hard for them to understand that this thing that they have been raised to believe as fact does not contain absolute facts.
Yeah, the raised to believe as fact part. That's what I think is the problem.
It takes a lot of unlearning.
Yeah.
And so it's a very difficult thing, but I, in my 30s, I'm still unlearning, and I'm still trying to remind myself to read critically and with everything that I read, challenge it. And it's hard. You have to be a very willing reader and learner to do that kind of work.
To understand that what you're reading might not be the end of all knowledge of a subject.
Or the willingness to learn it in some way. And then it would be hard as a teenager to know that I'm learning something that might not be certain and be tested on it. And then have to be willing someday to unlearn it more accurately.
Yeah, the testing.
And I think that's hard.
The testing drives so much of the conversation here. And this is what part of the problem is, right? It's just like, well, sometimes these textbooks get invented just to serve the purposes of making sure the students can do the tests. Yep. And it's just like,
it's very difficult.
It feels like something is very broken here.
Yeah, it does.
But yeah, I think that's a difficult one. When I went to college, my college was so very vehemently anti-textbook. We were like original sources only. We do not do textbooks here. And it's a great book school, so it's obviously a bit of a different approach. But I do actually agree with some parts of that conversation. And that's, I can hold in my head at the same time what you're saying about some of the advantages of using textbooks. But I do think this problem of thinking of these books as being like, as being the end, the authoritative voice on a subject, or, when they can summarize the whole Civil War down to like 6 paragraphs.
Yeah.
We know that cannot possibly be
right.
Even accurate, I guess, is what I would say. Like, it might be factually true, some of what it's saying, but is it an accurate representation of that historical event? No, probably not. Because accuracy it can be about how thoroughly content is approached. And obviously you still have some of the same issues of like interpretation and bias and all this stuff that we were talking about before. And yeah, I just think that conversation is not had with students explicitly, or at least it wasn't with me. Like my teacher was never like, this is a textbook. It's going to sometimes say things that might or might not be right or appropriate or I don't know, nuanced enough or whatever it is. Those conversations didn't happen. It was just like, here's your textbook, put your name in it. Right. This is what we're learning from. It's like, okay.
But that also means teachers have to know well enough.
True.
And not all of them do either.
Okay, so another question. Do you think that they too narrowly truncate knowledge to the point where learning lacks crucial context?
Yes.
Yeah.
Next question.
Me too. Me too.
I absolutely do.
The list of facts thing, I think, is really important here. When you have, and that's what a lot of textbooks end up being, some of the better ones do a better job with this problem. But when you think of a textbook as just like a dense list of things to know, that is sort of creating this environment where people have attitudes about learning that is not necessarily a good one. Like, okay, well, learning is just memorizing list of facts instead of engaging with historical context or engaging with an academic conversation around, challenging, sometimes very
for sure
difficult, even ethical questions, all kinds of stuff. Just all of that nuance gets flattened and erased, and publishers are especially trying not to alienate anybody to whom they're marketing these things. So they're trying to make everything as bland as humanly possible. So anyway, these books themselves tend to strip out context in a destructive way. So do you think textbooks are part of over-standardization and one-size-fits-all education?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Are they the only thing? No, not at all. But as far as one-size-fits-all education, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you figure we hand everybody the exact same book.
Yeah.
That's your first problem. And that's why I say that it takes a lot of work from a teacher to make a textbook useful and good and worthy and, all of these things. And that it's only really the skeleton for the rest of it. That's how I believe it should be treated, right? But this is also coming from someone who immediately was like, yeah, I don't want to teach a textbook. I mean, I do use it to go back and kind of come up with some ideas for, other units or something like that. But
Yeah, I think they can be inspiration,
for sure.
but I think that their usefulness to me stops at that point.
Yeah. You have to make it your own, You have to make it accurate. You have to make it reliable. You have to do a lot more with it.
Fill in the blank.
Here we go. Our next section where we ask you a question. You write us at hello@16to1.com. And regardless of your answer, we send you stickers.
Yeah.
Here we go. Most people would likely think that Pavlov won his Nobel Prize for his work with the dogs and the understanding of their trained responses. But it wasn't. For what did Pavlov win the Nobel Prize? It was his understanding of how the digestive system works.
Oh.
You're welcome. What you got this episode?
This episode's question is about the Olympics, which are approaching very quickly. So the Olympics, which have been played every 4 years since 1896, were canceled in 2020 due to COVID. Prior to COVID, what other 3 years were the Olympics canceled?
Yeah.
And Paris has hosted the Olympics twice before, and that was in 1900 and in 1924.
So 100 years later.
So even though all the Parisians are cranky and pooping in the Seine in protest,
it's because they couldn't poop in it last time.
This is not the first time. Okay. Would you
I
like?
cannot wait for the Olympics.
I know we like the Olympics.
Big Olympics
a
here.
lot.
Okay.
Okay. What'd you learn in the past couple of weeks?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So while I was at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I learned about a group called the National Capital Planning Commission.
Okay.
They're a group that was established in 1924, and they approve or disapprove of new monuments, memorials, and other things going on in and around Washington, D.C. And they are the group that gave feedback to the museum as the museum was being designed of what it could and couldn't look like.
So it's like the Capitol's HOA.
It's the Capitol's HOA. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why the Capitol has such a, like the mall, right? All of those buildings play very nicely together. That's why.
Yep.
It's because they've been forced to play nicely together.
It's been very intentionally planned.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's the group.
Cool.
So anything that happens to any of the Smithsonians, any of the monuments, any of the, things in and around DC, changes even, has to be approved by the National Capital Planning Commission. So you can't just do a facelift or you can't just whatever.
Can't just put on a fresh coat of paint even.
No. That's the group.
Okay.
What'd you learn?
Well, I was reading a bit about digital textbooks. And
of course you were.
Well, for this episode, some research. And I fell across this little tidbit, which I thought was very interesting. Have you heard of Project Gutenberg? Okay, so this is the first free library of ebooks on the internet. They have more than 70,000 titles now. They started way back in 1971 after the Project Gutenberg founder Michael S. Hart typed the Declaration of Independence into a plain text document and published it online. There are some other contenders for world's first ebook that were much earlier than that, but people are kind of not in agreement about what counts as the first one. This one gets cited frequently as maybe being the first.
So they decided it should have been the Declaration of Independence.
The Michael S. Hart typed that in particular, and that was his very first very
way
first
to
title,
start.
The Declaration of Independence. So yeah, that's what I learned. I thought that was interesting.
Cool.
Okay. Any other final wrap up thoughts for this week?
No.
No.
I'm gonna go to the beach.
I'm gonna go to the beach.
We'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. I just want everyone to know that we're so dedicated that we woke up at the 6 a.m. hour.
We did.
To record this, to try to find some peace in this motel. So anyways, okay.